there is something deeply strange about the human impulse to build a wall between the self and the world, and then call that wall protection. Humans construct barriers everywhere, between nations, between feelings, between one breath and the next. They build them from concrete, from silence, from ideology, from leather and rubber and activated charcoal filters pressed into the shape of a face, and then they strap these walls to their own heads and breathe. I have been thinking about this for over 100 years. I am a gas mask, model 1918, British issue, though I crossed the channel before the war ended and found my way into hands that trembled for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. And I have a great deal to say. Not about the war exactly. Not about the mechanisms of chlorine dispersal or the engineering of my filter canister or the particular shade of khaki they painted my carrying case. I want to talk about the faces I held. Every face I touched was trying to survive, something the world had not yet given a name to. Observation the first, the architecture of dread, 1917 to 1918. Before I was strapped to a face, I was an idea. That is worth sitting with. Every object that has ever held a human life, a ring, a rifle, a hospital bed, began as an idea inside a mind that was trying to solve a problem. My problem, the one I was engineered to solve, was this. The air had become treacherous. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, the actual air, the atmosphere itself. The invisible, taken-for-granted substance that had sustained every human breath since the first one. Someone had learned to poison it. I want you to understand what that does to a mind. There is a particular variety of fear, rarer than most people realize, that is not loud. It does not scream. It does not announce itself with a racing heart and tunnel vision. It arrives quietly, like water finding the hairline crack in a foundation. It is the fear that comes when something you believed was permanent turns out to be provisional. The ground beneath your feet, the loyalty of a friend, the safety of the next breath, the soldiers who first wore masks like me, and I was among the later, more refined models, the ones that came after the early, desperate improvisations of wet cloth and urine-soaked padding. Those soldiers carried a very specific psychological wound. They had learned that air was not safe. I was first placed over a face in the late winter of 1917. His name, the name of the first face I held, I never learned. I do not traffic in names. I traffic in sensations. The particular geography of a jaw, the pressure of a nose bridge, the way fear changes the temperature of skin. His skin was cold. Not the cold of weather, though the trench was a refrigerator in February. It was the cold that lives just beneath the surface when the body is conserving itself, pulling warmth inward, away from the extremities, away from the face, concentrating heat around the organs that matter, the body doing its arithmetic. His hands shook when he fitted me over his features. I felt the fumbling of the straps, the sharp tug when the buckle caught wrong, the correction. Someone nearby said something, a sentence I could not parse, possibly in the clipped, vowel-swallowing dialect of the north of England. And his hand steadied, just slightly. That is the first psychological truth I want to offer you. Human beings are steadied by the presence of other human beings, not by reassurance necessarily, not by the content of what is said. Often it is simply the fact of another voice. The acoustic proof that someone else is also still here, also still breathing, also still generating the vibrations of a living throat. That is enough to pull a trembling hand back from the edge of uselessness. He breathed through me that day without incident. No gas came, and yet the absence of the thing he feared did not relieve him. I felt that too, the way his breath did not slow into ease when the alert passed. He kept breathing as though each breath might be his last clean one, kept waiting for the contamination to arrive. This is a thing I observed repeatedly across the years and across the faces. Humans are very bad at releasing a fear that hasn't killed them yet. The danger passes. The all-clear sounds. The gas dissipates in the morning wind and the air returns to its ordinary breathable neutrality. and still the body keeps the account open. Still the nervous system files the report under ongoing rather than resolved. It is not stupidity. I want to be clear about that. I observed these men with something approaching reverence, the ones who wore me and the ones who refused to, the ones who slept with my carrying case within arm's reach, and the ones who lost their cases in the mud and spent their remaining weeks making a kind of peace with the possibility of a contaminated atmosphere. It is not stupidity. It is the architecture of dread. The mind builds it room by room, installs load-bearing walls, and then discovers that it cannot simply demolish what it has constructed without the whole structure of the self coming down with it. There was a second face later that same winter that I want to tell you about. He was older. An officer, I believe, though I have no visual memory of insignia, only the impressions of a face, and this face had spent more years in it than most around him. The lines of it told a particular story, a man who had expected his life to be one kind of story and had been handed another kind entirely. He placed me over his face with remarkable precision, no fumbling. The strap buckle found its catch on the first pass. The rubber seal pressed against his jawline, and I registered the immediate, slight elevation in temperature as his breath began to cycle through my filters. He was not afraid of the gas. He had already made a decision about the gas, some internal negotiation that I was not privy to but whose conclusion I could feel in the steadiness of his breathing. And the decision was essentially, whatever happens, happens. This is not bravery. I want to be precise about this because the word bravery gets misapplied so frequently that it has almost lost utility. This was not bravery. Bravery implies a confrontation with fear, an act of will that overrides the instinct towards self-preservation. This was something different. This was a man who had somewhere in the preceding months quietly closed certain accounts, who had, without fanfare or announcement, reclassified his own survival from a certainty to a possibility, and then finally, to a courtesy. A pleasant outcome he would not count on. The psychological reveal here, the hidden variable beneath his composure was not courage. It was grief. He was grieving himself, preemptively, quietly, with the particular dignity of a man who has decided that his feelings are not, under the present circumstances, the most important thing in any room. I held his face through one gas, attack and 3 false alarms. He never spoke while wearing me, which was not uncommon. My filters make conversation difficult, muffled, and strange. The voice returning to the speaker slightly altered as though passing through water, but his silence felt chosen rather than enforced. I think he was saying goodbye to things inside the silence, cataloging, maintaining, in whatever interior room he still had access to, some careful inventory of what he did not want to lose. Observation. The second, the long afterward, 1919 to 1947. The war ended. I want to say that more slowly, because the speed at which history recites those 3 words, the war ended, is obscene, given how long it took the men who survived it to believe they were true. The war ended, and I went into a case, and the case went into a kit bag, and the kit bag went onto a transport ship, and the transport ship crossed the channel and docked at Southampton on a morning so gray that the water and the sky were indistinguishable from each other. I was carried home by a man I will call the corporal, because that is what he was, and because the specific weight of his rank sits in my memory more clearly than anything else about him. He was young when he collected me from a supply depot in late 1917. He was no longer young when he carried me off that ship. This is not a metaphor for aging. His face, when I was occasionally removed from the case and inspected, he had a habit of checking his equipment in the evenings, a ritual that persisted long after the purpose of such rituals had dissolved. His face was technically the face of a man in his mid-20s, but the eyes operated on a different timeline. He took me home to a terraced house in a Midlands city whose name I never learned. There was a woman there, a wife, I understood from the particular register of tension that appeared in the corporal's body when he heard her footsteps, and there were things that had gone unsaid for so long that they had calcified into the structure of the household. load-bearing silences that nobody dared remove for fear of what would collapse. She asked him once, "I know this because I was on the shelf above the fireplace in my case during this conversation, and sound travels differently through metal and canvas than people assume." She asked him once what it had been like. He said, "Not as bad as some had it." I want to stay in that moment for a while. Not as bad as some had it. 5 words that contain, if you press them, an entire psychological architecture, an entire survival strategy for a man who has experienced something that civilian language does not have the structural load-bearing capacity to hold. He was not lying. It's important to say that. He was not being evasive or cowardly or deliberately withholding. He was being precise in the only way available to him, because to open the account, to begin the inventory of what those years had actually contained, would have required a shared language, and that language did not exist in that house, in that room, in that particular late evening of 1919. She had waited. She had written letters and managed the finances and made decisions that were supposed to be his to make, and she had done all of this with a kind of determined, brittle competence that is its own form of violence. The violence we do to ourselves when we decide to be fine, and he had returned, and neither of them knew how to translate what they had each survived into something the other could receive. This is the third psychological truth I want to offer. Survival, when shared incompletely, becomes its own form of isolation. The corporal survived the war, his wife survived the war. They survived it in rooms separated by the English Channel and by experiences that had no common currency. And then they were placed back into the same house and expected to resume the grammar of a shared life. I sat on the shelf above the fireplace for 11 years. He checked my case twice a year, once in spring, once in autumn, opening the brass clasp and lifting me out with the same careful, almost ceremonial attention he had given to all his equipment in the trench. He would inspect the rubber seal, run a thumb along the filter canister, hold the glass lenses up toward the window. Then he would put me back. I think these inspections were not about me. I think they were the only ritual left to him that connected the man he had been during those years, the man who had known exactly what he was doing and why, who had understood the precise function of each piece of his kit, who had operated inside a terrible clarity, to the man he was now, who could not always explain to himself why he felt nothing in rooms full of people, and everything in rooms that were empty. The Second World War came. I want to address the pause between these two sentences, 1919 to 1939, 20 years, not as historical context but as texture. 20 years of the corporal carrying something he could not put down and had not been offered a place to set. 20 years of the household navigating around the silences. 20 years of the carrying case being checked and closed, checked and closed. By 1939, the corporal was in his mid-40s. His son, there was a son, born in the early 20s, a boy with his mother's mouth and his father's habit of going quiet in crowded places, was old enough to be conscripted. The corporal gave me to his son the night before the boy shipped out. I felt this moment as the clasp was opened, as I was lifted from the case, by different hands now, younger, which have their own physical vocabulary entirely, a kind of latent energy in young hands that older hands have metabolized into stillness, and placed into the son's kit. The corporal said almost nothing. This is the fourth psychological truth. What cannot be spoken is sometimes given. He could not tell his son what the experience of war was. The language had never been built. The account had been kept closed for 20 years and was now sealed shut by the weight of its own duration. But he could give me. I was his testimony, his translation, his single, inadequate, entirely sincere act of preparation. This worn, checked twice yearly inspected mask, this object that had held his face through the very worst of it, pressed into the hands of someone he could not protect, and could not accompany, and could not warn in any language that the boy would actually be able to use. The son looked at me for a long moment, then put me in his bag. Observation the third, what remains? 1947 to now, the son came home. I will say that plainly, because it is not guaranteed, and because this particular story contains the mercy of it. He came home from the Second War with his own silences and his own way of standing in rooms as though slightly outside of them. And he kept me for many years, not on a shelf, not in a case, but in a cardboard box in a storage room that smelled of old paper and turpentine, before eventually passing me to a woman who was writing a history of respiratory equipment in 20th century warfare. She handled me with great care and a great deal of clinical attention. She photographed me, measured me, wrote my serial number into a ledger, noted the condition of the filter canister, sealed, corroded, non-functional, and the state of the rubber seal, degraded, significant cracking along the jawline, and the quality of the glass lenses, cracked, interior fogging consistent with prolonged humid storage. She was thorough and she was kind, and she treated me as evidence, which I am. But what evidence exactly? This is the question I have been sitting with for the years since I arrived in this collection, in this case behind this glass, with this label below me that I cannot read and do not need to. The easy answer is that I am evidence of a particular technology at a particular moment. The industrialization of warfare, the weaponization of chemistry, the engineering response to a world that had decided to poison its own atmosphere. This is true and useful and correct, and if you write it in an examination, you will receive full marks. But I want to offer the harder answer. I am evidence of what happens to human beings when the thing they took for granted turns out to be conditional: air safety. The idea that the world, despite everything, is fundamentally survivable. When that idea breaks, and it breaks differently for each person, at different pressures, along different fault lines, but it does break, the world is quite committed to breaking it. What remains is the face beneath the mask, the biology of fear, the particular, indestructible human need to find, in the presence of another voice, some evidence that this moment is not the end. I have held many faces. The young soldier in the February trench, hands shaking, steadied by a voice he couldn't quite hear. The officer making his inventory of things he did not want to lose. The corporal checking my case twice a year, maintaining a ritual whose function had outlasted its utility, because some part of him needed to prove to himself that he had brought the right things home. None of them were extraordinary people. This is not a diminishment. This is the most important thing I know. I think about what it costs a human being to put something like me over their face, not the physical act. That takes perhaps 30 seconds if the hands are steady. I mean the psychological cost. The admission contained in the gesture. The moment when a person looks at the air, the very air, and decides they require a mediation between themselves and it. That they cannot simply breathe. That the world, right now, requires a filter. There is something both terrible and quietly noble about that decision, because they make it. They make it and they strap the mask on, and they breathe through the filter, and they do not stop doing what they were doing, which was, in most cases, trying to survive long enough to go home to a house where someone was waiting with a question they would not know how to answer. The fifth psychological truth, the last one I will offer because I'm approaching the end of what I know how to say. Human beings are not broken by the terrible things that happen to them. They are broken slowly by the impossibility of translating those things into language that the people they love can receive. The war breaks you faster, but the silence afterward does the longer work. I have been in this collection for some decades now. People come and look at me through the glass. I observe them back, through my cracked lenses, through the oxidized copper of my housing, through the silence that accumulates in museum rooms the way sediment accumulates at the bottom of a still body of water. Some of them take photographs. Some of them lean close and read the label, and I watch their faces do something quiet and interior. A small muscle movement near the eyes, a slight alteration in their breathing, barely perceptible, that tells me they have just made some connection between the object in the case and the people who are not here to be looked at. I have breathed the air of a changing world, trench air, thick with the anticipation of something terrible. The cold, clean air of a channel crossing on a gray November morning, salt and diesel and the smell of distance. The air of a Midlands terraced house, coal smoke and boiled cabbage, and the particular density of things that have been left unsaid for so long that they have become atmospheric. Museum air now. The careful climate-controlled atmosphere of a room dedicated to preservation. The intention is to stop time, or at least to slow it, to maintain me in something approaching my original state, to keep the evidence intact. But time is less cooperative than archivists. The rubber continues to degrade. The lens continues to cloud. The oxidation proceeds at its own pace, indifferent to the controlled humidity. I find I do not mind. An object that has held as many faces as I have, that has been pressed against as much fear and steadied as many hands, and traveled as many miles in canvas cases and cardboard boxes. Such an object accumulates something that is not quite memory and not quite meaning, but lives somewhere in between. Call it weight. Call it the gravity of having been necessary. Was necessary once. Genuinely, urgently necessary. The thin engineered membrane between a human being and a world that had decided for a season to be unbreathable. And then I became a relic. Then a historical artifact. Then a museum piece. Then perhaps a YouTube video, which is its own particular form of afterlife, stranger than any I might have predicted. I am a gas mask. I am corroded copper and cracked glass and rubber that gave out decades before the seal of memory did. I am a piece of technology built to answer a specific question. Can a human being survive this air? And the answer, in the mouths of the people who wore me, was always the same. Yes. For this breath, yes. For this one breath, taken through a filter, through a fog, through the cracked and insufficient lens of whatever you can manage to put between yourself and the worst of it, yes.